into the 220 session for the IBC, Illinois City International Business Conference. Again, it's a one-day conference, student run. There's going to be sessions running all night long. Today, in this session, we welcome Joseph Seliga, who is a partner at Mayer Brown, which is one of the largest law firms in the world. He's been there 23 years. And surprisingly, I've known him since we were 14 years old. Very different career path. So one of the things that Joe works on, and if you look at their law firm's website, is a expert in the legal litigation in regards to what they call P3 or public partnerships, where private industry and public funding come together, or sometimes the other way around. If it's public works, for example. So if you look, when the bio was sent for Joe, he was talking about roads and bridges and all these things. I says, forget that. Talk about the NFL draft that you brought here. Yeah, I mean, that's the gold mine. So in that regard, there was a lot of information that Joe can share with you guys about business law. Is anybody here taking business law course currently? No? Awesome. You're going to enjoy this. So in that regard, welcome Joe Seliga, and he will begin his presentation, again, solving infrastructure through public-private partnerships.
All right, well, thanks very much, Vladimir, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming to this session. I really appreciate you joining me for this discussion. So as Vlad said, my name is Joe Seliga. I'm a partner at the law firm Mayer Brown, based here in Chicago. Maybe I'll start off with just a little bit of biographical information before I go into the presentation. And the presentation will be a fairly detailed description about work related to infrastructure transactions utilizing public-private partnership structures. But before I do that, just a little bit of background. I grew up in Chicago on the southwest side of the city. I don't know if there's any south side of Gage Park. Anybody know Gage Park? Are you from Gage Park? Or, yeah, 56th in Richmond.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So. Sure. Okay, yeah. And I grew up at Gage Park, when I was young, and then and attended what was Quigley South High School, which is now St. Rita High School at 79th and Western. That's how Vladimir and I know each other. We went to high school together on the south side. So I grew up there. I was fortunate enough to go off for college and graduate school, and then came back to law school at Northwestern here in Chicago. And then really since that time, I worked for a judge for 1 year, but ever since that time, I've been working in a law firm setting, which is not what I originally intended to do. I thought I might just do it for a couple of years and then go off and do other things. But I've stayed, from 2001 until now, working in this area of infrastructure and government transactions. So Mayer Brown is a very large law firm. We have 1,800 lawyers worldwide. The firm was founded in Chicago in 1881, and there's about 300 lawyers in Chicago itself, in the Chicago office. And in addition to the lawyers who are in the Chicago office, we also have an extensive business services staff who supports the functioning of the law firm. So many of the different other functions that you need at a law firm are based out of our Chicago office. Not all of them, but many of them. So things like accounting and marketing and business development support. Many of those functions either are based, or HR, that's another area, either are based out of Chicago, or a significant amount of staff members are based in Chicago because of the history of the firm having started here. But currently we have around 25 offices worldwide. Chicago is still the largest of the offices within the law firm, and it is a full service law firm, which means I'd call it a full service business law firm. So as it relates to needs of businesses, and for purposes of this presentation, that also includes governmental entities. Mayer Brown works with a variety of different businesses and governmental entities across different transactional matters. We have a corporate group, a finance practice, tax, real estate, and then also within litigation and all types of business litigation and business disputes within those parts of the firm. So I pretty much, when I was going through law school, I knew that I wanted to work in something transactional. I really didn't want to be a litigator. I really didn't want to, my personality is not really made for adversarial type matters, which are the types of matters that you work on when you're a litigator. But I preferred to do something that was transactional related or regulatory and compliance related, where you're trying to work with parties to get business deals done. You're trying to document those transactions and advise your client on the legal aspects of the transaction. But in many cases, the lawyers are really acting as an advisor broadly to the parties in the transaction and helping them work together to address their issues and then document it within the contract that the parties are entering into. So I had an interest in transactional work. I also, having grown up in Chicago, was interested in government, to some extent government and politics, and was looking for a place that I could work, that I could practice law within that type of setting. And Mayer Brown has historically had a leading practice within government transactions and has done a significant amount of work related to the city of Chicago and various other sister agencies of the city, as well as various other state agencies. And so that attracted me to the law firm when I was in law school, and then when I started after law school, and have been able to work within that practice since that time. But the practice has really evolved significantly since that time. And my hope is we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm happy to talk more about that and kind of the journey of my practice over this time, because it's a lot different now from when I had started. But a big part of the difference of that is this work within infrastructure public-private partnerships, which have really taken off over the last 20 years. As Vladimir had alluded to earlier, most of what I'm going to talk about today is really about infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure. But we also work in a variety of other ways on things that you could also call public-private partnerships. So as Vladimir mentioned, we advised the Choose Chicago, which is the tourism bureau of the city of Chicago, on the NFL draft, which was held here in Chicago. Well, the first two times that the draft was held outside of New York City, we're here in Chicago. Some of you may remember that. We worked on the legal arrangements related to that, and worked on the NBA All-Star Game also for Choose Chicago when that was held just before the pandemic in 2020. And then most recently, we've been working with NASCAR on the NASCAR street race that last year, and again with the plans for this year, again working on the legal arrangements that relate to hosting these large-scale events. So the practice in which I work is very broad and diverse. That's one of the reasons that I've enjoyed working at it. And that answers the question. When I said earlier I thought I might only stay for 2 years and I've stayed for 23, it's because every day has been different. It's hard to predict what'll happen during the course of the day when I wake up, because the different types of transactions that we work on and matters that we work on kind of vary and change over time, and we've been fortunate to have opportunities to work on quite a variety of different things over the years. So anyway, with that background, I'm going to dive in here and into the presentation. So you're kind of setting the stage for the need for public-private partnerships. The need for infrastructure investment in our country is great. It was estimated in 2021 to be a need of about $2.6 trillion, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And the country has, and the economic impact of that need is also great. So that same organization estimated that there would be $10 trillion in lost gross domestic product if those infrastructure needs were not met. So, meaning, if roads aren't repaired or airports aren't improved, the electric grid, which is in significant need of investment, moving to renewable energy, if those things aren't done, the U.S. economy could be impacted to the tune of $10 trillion. And within the last several years, significant steps have been taken to address this need, but there's still significant need out there. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the bipartisan infrastructure law that was adopted toward the end of 2021, signed into law by President Biden, that directs $1.2 trillion of federal funds toward a variety of different infrastructure areas in transportation, energy, and climate. And then the year after, in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act is another law that authorizes various financing assistance, particularly for transportation and clean energy projects, where the federal government offers different types of financing assistance to help generate investment within these areas of infrastructure. So there have been steps that have been taken to address some of these needs. There's significant public funds that are available for infrastructure, but even $1.2 trillion is a huge sum of money, but it's still not even half of the need that was identified before the infrastructure law was passed. And I was in a call recently where people are talking about preparing for the next infrastructure law, because that infrastructure law, that 1.2 trillion, is to be spent over a course of about 5 years from passage. So 2026, we'll be here in no time, and people are already talking about, well, what's the next infrastructure law going to be, and what is the spending level, and what are we going to spend on for that law? So you may think, well, okay, there's a lot of money that's out there, so why do we need public-private partnerships? The idea of public-private partnerships is to be able to leverage public investment with private capital to be able to meet infrastructure needs. And I have a slide here talking about what public-private partnerships are and what they are not. So, what they are is that opportunity to leverage public investment with private investment. And I'll give some examples of how that's done. It's an opportunity to shift risk to private parties. So instead of the government having to take all the risk of a particular project, some of that risk gets shifted to private parties, which are then responsible for meeting those needs. And there's contractual obligations that they have, and that could be enforced against those parties if they don't meet those obligations. And they could be creative solutions to challenging projects. So public-private partnerships are particularly well suited for very challenging projects that have, say, and again, I'll talk about some of these examples, but where there's significant risk related to an asset, or a need to develop a certain type of creative solution to an infrastructure challenge, a really large project that's not in the normal course. So it wouldn't necessarily be something that you would do just to build a street or a road in the normal course, but it's particularly well suited to very complex projects. So public-private partnerships are not several other things, including free money. So oftentimes when we're working with different parties, and particularly public entities who haven't worked on public-private partnerships before, they think, well, this is just, the private sector is just going to put money into a project, and that's going to replace the public money that's involved. And that's not the case. There is money that's put into these projects, but at the same time, private entities are going to be looking for some return on that investment with respect to the funds that are being put in. There's lots of benefits that come from that, including the risk transfer and other benefits of the private investment that comes into the project. But it's not as if that private money just comes in and just replaces the need for any public money, or frankly, for any type of public involvement. So, another thing that public-private partnerships are not, are an opportunity for shifting all responsibility from government. So in other words, a public entity party to a public-private partnership still has responsibility in the relationship. And that includes, cooperating with respect to covenants that they may have in an agreement, like giving permits and approvals for a particular project. Certain risks public entities still take on as part of the contractual arrangement. And then there's the need to continue to oversee the private entity's compliance with the contract. You can't just enter into a contract and then walk away and say, well, I've washed my hands of this. The private entity is now fully responsible. You have to oversee what they're doing and ensure that that the private entity is complying with the terms of the contract that it's entered into. Finally, public-private partnerships are not easy. They do take an awful lot of effort. Many of these transactions is taken, not only months or weeks or months, but years to be able to enter into. There's one that I haven't included in my presentation, but that comes to mind, where we're working in the state of Alabama on a bridge project that we started working on in 2017. And that was after this project had been in the works for years and years before. And we're in 2024, and the project is still in the stage of project planning, and just finally at the point of getting close to executing a contract. And there's a long story behind that, but it's an example of how these projects take significant amount of time to be able to get completed. So, in terms of business opportunities and public-private partnerships, I'll talk in more detail about the perspective from someone who's at a law firm, but I just wanted to highlight the variety of other areas. If this is an area that you find interesting, that you could potentially get involved in, and certainly law is one of them, but it's not the only one. So I've split this in a couple slides, and there's a couple other areas that I haven't included that I probably should have. I'll talk about in the next slide. So one is government officials. I mean, the government officials are an important player within these transactional arrangements, and one of the challenges within public entities is government officials are just pulled in so many different directions. And it's, in some ways, there hasn't been sufficient funding to support kind of the staffing and personnel needs that we need at public agencies. So as a result, it's a bit of a challenge to be able to have individuals within governmental entities who are able to focus on these transactions, because it does really require ideally one or more public officials to be a point person to say, it's your job to get this done. Well, oftentimes it's a person who has 100 other things that they have to get done, and that's one of the challenges. But there's a need for people within government who have this kind of experience and could help drive forward these transactions. Equity investors. There are many different investors within infrastructure. I'll give some examples of that in the context of some of the case studies that I'll talk about. But from an investment component, there's significant opportunities in this space. Financing parties. So equity is one form of financing, but there's also debt financing. So, meaning there's banks. The insurance companies are another provider. Insurance companies have significant amount of capital that they get from people who buy insurance policies, and they need to find ways to invest that capital in ways where they're also watching the risk of the money that they're holding on your behalf as a policyholder. So one of the areas in which they invest is infrastructure. So there's a variety of different opportunities there from a financing standpoint. Construction contractors, obviously important in developing new infrastructure and rehabilitating infrastructure. So those are prime contractors, and there's numerous other subcontractors typically on these large projects. And the same with operations and maintenance contractors. So after you construct a large project, say it's a road or a bridge or a new airport terminal or a new university building, and some of those have been built through public-private partnerships. These contracts often include obligations to maintain the building over a significant period of time, say 30 or 40 years. And there are contractors who do that, again, primes and subs. And then there's opportunities for disadvantaged business enterprises, minority business enterprises, women-owned business enterprises, or veterans-owned business enterprises. So a variety of different business enterprises that through public contracting laws, there are opportunities to be able to contract as subcontractors on various of these projects. And that could be in construction, it could be in operation and maintenance, it could be law firms. You know, we've worked with DBE, WBE law firms as co-counsel within the space, could be financial advisors. So, you know, there's opportunities in terms of developing and owning a business within the DBE, WBE space that provide kind of direct opportunities within these public-private partnership transactions. So you know, many of those examples are kind of the principal parties that are involved in getting the transaction done. But then there's a variety of other people who help support the transaction occurring. So one of those could be financial advisors. So, you know, financial firms that are then hired by the investor to structure the transaction, or hired by a governmental entity to help structure the transaction. And there's, you know, there's investment banks, other types of accounting firms like EY and KPMG are two accounting firms that are very active in the space that we work with very often. But there's a variety of other firms like that work within the space. Law firms, obviously, and I'll talk more about that. Program managers, so those would be technical advisor companies that help manage a particular program. We're working on a large project in New York and New Jersey right now to build a new tunnel under the Hudson River. And they just announced a contract with a joint venture of 3 different firms that are going to help manage the construction and delivery of that project. So they're not the construction contractors, but they are the people that are going to be out there overseeing the construction contractors, making sure all the different pieces of the project work together. So that's a whole nother area, and there's a number of firms that are very active in that space. Construction engineers, you know, the engineers who are the ones who draw up the plans and solve the technical challenges to construct these projects. Traffic consultants, you know, particularly if you have a road project, and I'll be talking about a number of different road projects that have tolls on them. Well, there are traffic consultants that in order to finance an infrastructure project, you need to have a view of how many people will use the road and how much are they willing to pay. You know, think about if you're on the Illinois Tollway, how much are you willing to pay? And based on how much you're willing to pay, that will support debt that would be used to construct a road or improve the road. And traffic consultants work in that area. 2 other types of advisors that I should have included. One is just in the area of public relations. That's often not as effectively utilized as an advisory service as it could be on these projects, because in undertaking these projects, there's a really important component of educating the public about what the project is and what the benefits of the project are, and to be able to address issues that arise from the public. There are a number of firms that are active in that area, and that maybe work more broadly across public relations more generally, but do a significant amount of work within this space. And another is insurance advisors. So for many of these contracts, there are insurance policies that are required within the contract, and there are insurance advisors who help structure those provisions, and then insurance brokers who are involved in helping to sell the insurance that's needed for these large projects, because that's a significant area in terms of mitigating the risks related to these projects. I'm gonna just pause for a second before I go into the law firm perspective. Let me just see if there's anyone have any questions about any of that overview. Yep, Mike.
So who, how does Mayor Brown get hired?
That's a good question. So, and that's, when I talk about how my career's evolved, one of the aspects of practicing law in a law firm is you spend a lot of the early years of practice actually doing the work. I mean, understanding the transactions, drafting documents, and working with your colleagues and with clients. And then at a certain time, if you keep doing it, you have some responsibility to help bring in the business in order to keep the business operating and to be able to have enough work to support the other lawyers that you're bringing in to kind of behind you to continue the business. And within our space, it's a challenging area. There are some parts of law firm practice where there are established clients that have worked with a law firm for many, many years. And, there, at least when I had started, there was kind of a bit of a tradition, and some of this has moved away, from this historically, but you still see some of it out there where, a partner will basically work with a particular client for years and years and then hand off that client to the next partner. And you didn't really have to worry about where the business was coming from. That's also been challenged because even those long-term relationships, people have realized that, you might be able to get lower rates with a different law firm, or you think someone else, you might be willing to pay more because you think some other law firm, may be better or may have, more resources. So even in that area, it's been challenged. But within the work that we do, we're often being hired on a matter by matter basis, meaning like a project or transaction by transaction basis. And that means that we're very often working to get hired on projects. And in most cases, either there are legal requirements, say if you're a public entity, we're being hired by a public entity, legal requirements to bid out that work, or issue a request for proposals for law firms to respond to. And that process is often used also by private entities. So private, say if we're advising an investor on a project, they don't have a legal requirement to bid it out, but they'll often have business requirements where they have to internally demonstrate that they've often gone to, say, 3 law firms. Usually that's what we hear. Well, we had to go to 3 firms to get proposals. So for the private entity proposals, those are usually generally more straightforward and streamlined, and you're putting in your qualifications and you're putting in a fee proposal. And then the client's making a decision, on the combination of qualifications and fees. And then with respect to public entities, those can be really, really challenging proposals just because, one of the aspects of, public procurement is there are requirements that might apply to a construction procurement that apply to, buying the chairs. I mean, NEIU is subject to public procurement. So I mean, buying the chairs that you're sitting on, there's laws that, and that some of those laws are also used to apply to choosing law firms. So sometimes we're getting a document that says, that has things that it's hard for us to figure out how to respond to because it's really for a company that's selling toilet paper or chairs, not legal services. But, we've got to figure out how to kind of make the square peg fit into the round hole. And, and many times with public entities and with public-private partnerships, which don't, these for public entities, it might be once in 10 years that they're undertaking this type of transaction. They're looking for counsel on a particular project, and yeah. They're often advised by other advisors who help them in the selection process, but that's one of the other challenges. For us, it's how to explain our experience to a public entity that hasn't really undertaken a public-private partnership before, and that's what we're doing through the response.
You mentioned the infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion.
That's a good question. And it's a little complicated because there's one component. So just to give an example, one component of that 1.2 trillion is highway funding. So the highway funding is on a formula basis, and I'm gonna have trouble remembering the exact amount, but it's fairly, it's a significant portion of the overall portion for highway funding.
Weren't they doing something for the lakefront as well?
Right. So that's another example. So there are also funds that are allocated to specific projects. And then there's also funds that are on a competitive basis by certain states or regions competing to get awarded those funds. So that's one of the, within that total, there's certain amount, particularly the highway funds that are kind of coming as of right. And then there's other components that the different states are competing for pieces of it. O'Hare would be an example. Chicago's gotten an allocation toward the O'Hare expansion, but it's only a certain portion of the funds toward that. But that was awarded
So is that
to the
one? So one of our speakers, Tracy Payne, that was here this
Okay.
morning, spoke of that application for Gate 5, I think it's called.
Right, Terminal 5, yeah, the Terminal 5 reconstruction that was done, yes.
And so it was 81 million, she said. So a portion of that came from.
So that one, so I think that was from the last program, and then my understanding is that there's funds through this bill toward the new Terminal 2. So this global gateway project that they're still, the Department of Aviation is working to advance with the airlines. And there's been some press on that, in terms of, one of the challenges with airport financing, one of the things I've said is airport financing is itself a form of public-private partnership, because the airlines wind up paying for part of that cost. I mean, when when there's a new airport project, or even to maintain an airport, you as a passenger are paying fees that help support the costs of running the airport, but those fees go into the bottom line of the airlines themselves. And then when you're undertaking a large capital project, just like Terminal 5 was one example of that, and now with this new Global Gateway Terminal 2 project, the city has to work with the airlines to develop the plan of finance, because the airlines are really contributing to the overall cost. So the federal portion is one, and that's one of the other aspects of this. You're basically cobbling together a variety of different funding sources. There could be federal funds, not always, but sometimes there's federal funds. There could be a state contribution, a local contribution, fees on users, say tolls, or one of the other areas of airport financing is just the concessions at the airport. Whenever you buy something at an airport, that's going toward supporting the operations of the airport, and particularly with airports, again with the airlines as one of those parties, they're trying to figure out what's going to be attractive to them and their bottom line, and they're also looking at it. I think one of the recent articles about the Terminal 2 project was talking about, United has a hub in Denver, so they might move some of their planes, from O'Hare to Denver. Particularly people who are flying through don't necessarily need to. If you're going from New York to Los Angeles, you could go through Chicago, or you could go through Denver. And airlines, American Airlines has a large hub in Dallas, so there are decisions that they make to say, well, what's my cost of being at this airport? And, I want to have really good infrastructure, but I also want to, I've got to think about how much I'm paying and how much I'm paying relative to somewhere else. So those are all some of the things that go into it.
I have another question. When you're talking about the finance for municipal, is that like the municipal bonds?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So public-private partnerships are a form. So let me step back. Before we even get to public-private partnerships, municipal financing would be sort of the typical way that the governmental entity will finance a project is the government will issue the debt. So I'm trying to come up with kind of an easier. Right, exactly. So yeah, like I mean, on the tollway would be an example, or even on the Chicago expressways, the state would issue. Well, maybe I'll use that as an example. So the expressway project, like the Kennedy Expressway project, which I'm sure has impacted many of you here, and I know they're about to start it again. So that. Obviously we don't pay tolls when we're driving on the Kennedy. If for the one way that the state, and I'm not sure exactly how the state's financing the Kennedy work, but one way that the state finances highway construction work is to issue debt through general obligation bonds. Basically, the state is telling the bond market, you buy bonds, so you buy debt of the state of Illinois, and we promise to pay that back with interest. And it's tax exempt because it's from a governmental entity. So the buyer of the bond doesn't have to pay tax on the interest that they're getting on the bond. And as a general obligation bond, the state of Illinois has to come up with the money. Basically, it's saying we're going to figure out a way to come up with the money to pay for this. Okay. And if the state didn't do that and it defaulted on the debt, that would have significant repercussions for the state. And occasionally you find, it doesn't happen often, but occasionally you find that it has not happened in the state of Illinois. But there's some other jurisdictions, particularly outside of Illinois, where that's occurred. Then the other example at a high level would be what's called revenue bonds. So let's think about the Illinois tollway. So if you're driving on the tollway, we pay tolls, you got your transponder, you're paying those tolls. So the Illinois State Toll Highway Authority, yes, it's Illinois, but it's actually a separate agency of government. It's not part of the state of Illinois. It's a separate state agency. And as the Illinois State Toll Highway Authority, under the laws pertaining to the Illinois State Toll Highway Authority, they have the ability to issue debt, but that debt is principally revenue bonds, which means the holder of the bonds is being told that you will get paid out of toll revenue by the authority. And if there's not sufficient toll revenue, the holder of the bonds is taking that risk. So for example, during COVID, when there were less people riding on toll roads, there was concern. Now the toll roads came back pretty quickly. There was a big dip in March 2020, and then it started coming back again. But there was concern that there wouldn't be enough revenue to meet the debt obligations on those bonds. Now, one way that bondholders get protected in that is there certain covenants that are included as to the level of tolls. So if you don't have enough revenue, the agency is typically required under this covenant to increase tolls sufficiently to meet the obligations to the debt holders. And there's also what are called debt service coverage ratios that say, for the amount of debt, you expect to have enough revenue to cover that debt. This is where the traffic consultant comes in. Traffic consultant says, well, we think enough people will ride the road at this toll to cover the debt with a cushion, so that if something like COVID were to happen, the cushion would help insulate the bondholders. But if that's not enough, the public agency has some obligation to try to increase the tolls. But if that isn't sufficient, there's the possibility that the bondholders, they're taking that risk. The only issue with that is the public agency also takes the risk. If the public agency defaults in that scenario, I mean, it's bad for everybody. It's bad for the bondholders because they don't get repaid, but it's bad for the public agency because it would impact their credit rating. But the difference in the two scenarios is, in the first scenario, the state has to come up with the money somewhere. In the second scenario, the money's only coming from the toll revenues. And that gets more complicated too, because in some deals, there's a separate backstop beyond the toll revenue. This is one of the issues that's going on now with the new stadiums for the White Sox and the Bears. It's the White Sox and the Bears are looking for some type of debt to be issued by a public entity. And then the question is, what is the source of revenue to pay for that debt? And is that revenue, sufficient to cover the debt? So there's a significant number of issues there in the structuring of the debt. Well, yeah, for the Bears, I mean, they were talking Arlington Heights, and now they're talking about in Chicago, but yeah, either, right. It's right. That's
Okay,
right.
my last
Oh,
question,
sure.
I promise.
Yeah, it's okay.
How do we get hired in?
Oh, well, I'm not an expert on our hiring process, but I know that there are postings. So there are definitely postings online. If any of you feel free to contact me, and I'll be here afterward and give you my card and my details on the presentation. But I know that we do have postings, and it is, I mean, the process to get hired as a lawyer is a complicated process, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you about that. But also in terms of business, right? As I mentioned earlier, there's so many other positions that we have, and I think that's one of the things I really want to emphasize is within business opportunities, and there are people who started their career at Mayor Brown on the business side, and then decide, well, I want to go practice law, and then went on to law school. So those are publicly posted. We have a LinkedIn page. I think between LinkedIn and also on other websites, but I could help figure that out. But they are definitely posted, and in my practice, the ones that I typically am aware of are on the business development side, because we'll hire individuals to help us with all those proposals. The ones that Mike Butters was asking about. There are people that we work with who are a critical part of our team who help put together those proposals, and they get to understand and know our business, and they're writing about why we should be hired. We have pricing people too. The pricing component of what we do, which is incredibly difficult and competitive, and we have to make sure, because oftentimes our clients, I'm going into a lot of detail here, but our clients are asking us to put caps on our legal fees. So we're entering into an agreement to do legal work. We can't fully predict what's going to happen. And a client will say, well, we want to cap your fees at a certain level, or we want a certain discount, or we want this or that. So we have people in pricing who help us think through those aspects. Now, we tie it into various assumptions. If we're assuming that the deal is going to work out this way or take this long, but if it turns out differently, there could be an adjustment, but that's another part of the business, that works with us. So there's a variety of different, we have a marketing team that's separate from the business development team who writes, press release. We have a social media manager who manages all our social media. So there's a variety of different places within a law firm beyond, the practice of law. And one of the things about Chicago that we're very fortunate about is we have a number of law firms that started in Chicago, and that still have a large base of their business operations in Chicago. So Mayor Brown's one of them. Sidley is a law firm that started, Kirkland and Ellis, which is has now become one of the absolute largest law firms in the world. Those are all law firms that started in Chicago and still have a large part of their business operations based in Chicago. So that creates unique opportunities that we have in Chicago that say, many of the other places where Mayor Brown has offices don't necessarily have those other functions or jobs related to those other functions in those cities. Some of them do, but not all of them do. So there's opportunities that are tied into that. All right, so any other questions? Okay. All right, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna jump around. I'm not gonna get through all my slides, but some of them are really in depth, and I've used this presentation in law settings, so I wasn't necessarily intending to cover everything, but some of this I've already covered. So, you know, the law firm perspective on P3s, multiple of our different practice areas are tied in to public-private partnerships, and we usually have large teams of lawyers, you know, who are working on them. And I've talked about some of the different types of transactions in which, you know, across every type of infrastructure, really. And you know what? I'm gonna move along here. This is some of the perspectives of contractors and projects, but I'm gonna focus on two other areas. One is this slide with the continuum of P3 models, and then I'm going to talk about three different specific transactions. So within public-private partnerships, at least in infrastructure, there are a variety of different types of transaction structures that are utilized. And one of the initial stages of undertaking any P3 is to work with the public sector entity. And this is why, yes, being on the public sector side can be really interesting and you know, creative, because you often have to sit down and say, well, what are your objectives? And which of these types of models do you want to utilize to achieve your objectives? So I'm just going to try to run through these fairly quickly. And you'll see, you know, it's along this continuum, with the left side being, you know, more risk to the public sector, and the right side being more risk to the private sector. So one is DB, which is design build. That combines design and construction. The private entity is giving a guaranteed maximum price, basically saying our price won't exceed this amount. Although there are certain circumstances in which, just like the example I gave with a law firm that might put a cap on its rates and has certain assumptions, the contract is also including certain types of assumptions related to the construction of the project. And if those assumptions aren't met, that might relate, those are often called relief events, where the contractor gets relief if there's a significant delay outside of its control, or the concept of force majeure, something that happens outside of its control. But in this context, there's no shift of O&M, which is operation and maintenance, and F, which is financing risk. So the government still has to, after the project is built, the government has to operate and maintain it. So if the contractor did its work within the cap, it all sounds great, but they built something that's really not well constructed, and it costs a lot of money to maintain it, we can't go back to the contract unless there was some warranty that they didn't comply with. But if it's just they did it in the normal course, the public entity then has to be responsible for maintaining it. Public entity has to figure out how to pay for it and finance it. DBF is similar to design build, but it also shifts to the contractor some or all of the risk to financing the project. So public entities often will use that, where a public entity will have an allocation of funds, but it'll be paid over time. So this federal infrastructure bill could be an example. Some of those funds will be paid over a 4-year period. So the public entity may go out to contractors and say, we want you to start building this now, but we don't have all the money now. So we think it's better for you to go out and get financing, say from a bank, to pay for the cost or some of the cost of building the project. And we promise we will pay you over time as we get the money that comes into us. The next is called DBOM, design, build, operate, maintain. That's similar to a design build, but it also includes that long-term operation and maintenance. So that helps address some of the risks that I talked about earlier, where the contractor builds it, but they don't stick around to maintain it. And the government has to take the risk that it might not have been built well enough to sustain a 30-year period of maintenance. So the contractor then has to, so that is utilized in part to help ensure that what they build, they'll also be incentivized to build well enough to maintain in an economically efficient way. Then this is where things get interesting. So this is design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. This would be a classic public-private partnership transaction. And what I've done here is, and I've alluded to some of this as we've talked on the left side. I've laid out what's called the classic approach, which would be without a P3 and then the P3 approach. So on the left side, you have the public authority. The public authority issues municipal debt, which is what we were talking about not long ago through a bank. And there are capital funds for the government. The government basically gets money, say from the federal government through the infrastructure bill, and it contributes it to the public entity to cover the costs of construction. And then the public authority enters into a contract with a construction contractor, which could be a design build contract. It could be also design bid build, which is the more traditional way of construction, where the public entity designs the project and the construction contractor is just bidding to build it, and it's awarded on the lowest cost basis. And then there may be a contract to an operation and maintenance company or contractors to operate and maintain the project. Under the P3 approach, it's similar, but there's some important differences. So we've got the public authority is still there, but the public authority is entering into the DBFOM contract, which is the P3 contract, with the equity investor, which is typically a limited liability company or a special purpose vehicle entity that is created to develop that particular project. That entity is then taking the risk of financing and constructing the project. So that's the entity that then issues debt through banks and other lenders, and includes equity investment from the sponsors. So it's not the public authority that's doing the financing, it's that limited liability company. And it's that limited liability company, not the public entity, that's entering into the construction contract and the operation and maintenance contract. And the dashed lines are meant to indicate two other aspects. Oftentimes, the equity consortium is a mix of equity investors that are there, from an investment. Their goal is investing in projects for their equity holders and bringing these projects together, sort of planning and undertaking the project. But usually, if it's a construction project, the construction contractor company often also takes a piece of the equity as well. So they'll often have an entity that's basically contributing money from the construction company and getting an investment out of it, as well as getting the contract for the construction work. Why would you do that? Well, you want to do that in part so that you, as the construction contractor that's taking a significant amount of the risk on the project, through that equity, you're at the table with the other equity holders. You have a say in what they're deciding, because if you don't, they'll decide it, and then they'll just shift all the risk to you as the construction contractor. So that's helps explain some of the differences. And then the interface agreement is an agreement between the construction contractor and the operation and maintenance contractor to allocate risks between them, because both of those parties have risk as it relates to the limited liability company, and they want to make sure between them there's no ambiguity as to who has what risk in the areas that literally interface, like when the construction gets done and when the operations begin, and what aspects of the construction work may be the contractor's responsibility even after the maintenance party is taking over. What if they didn't build it properly? So that's the basis for the interface agreement. So I think I'm going to move along here. Okay, I'm going to talk about two forms of design, build, finance, operate, and maintain contracts, typical P3 contracts. And again, this is going to sound somewhat familiar with some of the things I said earlier, but with a slight twist. So one is the project could be a so-called revenue risk model. So in that case, the developer is taking all or virtually all of the project risk, meaning the construction and the financing and operation and maintenance. They are financing the project, and they're financing it based on the revenue from the project. So like a toll road, again, you know, that we were talking about earlier, it could be tolls, or, you know, or other, well, you know, as it says here, other user fees or some other revenue source. Developer establishes this special purpose vehicle or limited liability company. There's often a lease, but it could be a license. It's more of a real estate concept in terms of the property rights that limited liability company has. The agreement's usually long-term, often 50 years or more, because of the need to support the financing of the project. You need to raise enough tolls to pay for the debt that you use to build or acquire the project. And then there's a mix of equity and third-party debt, which I talked about in the last slide. And there could be debt from the federal government. So there's certain federal financing programs where the federal government says, we're going to loan some money from the federal government at low interest to help get the project done. And oftentimes that comes in toward the end of a project. And it's a way to get some large projects that have a significant amount of risk done, where the federal government's taking a piece of the risk along with the equity and banks or bondholders. So then there's another form of this design, build, finance, operate, and maintain type structure called an availability payment model. So you're going to see some of these things are similar, but there's a couple that are very, very importantly different. So one is the developer takes all or virtually all the project risk. That's the same. Financing, in this case, is based on payments from the public authority. It's not based on those toll revenues. The public authority says, I will give payments to you if you comply with the terms of the contract. And those terms of the contract, the concept of availability payments are during the operation maintenance phase. After it's constructed, are you making the project available? So if you built a road and the road is falling apart and it's not available, we, the government, can deduct from the amount that we pay you. So the private entity is taking the risk that they're going to comply with the contract and get the full amount of the payment. But if they do a bad job, they get less money. And the same during construction. There's a concept of milestone payments. If you build the project by a certain time and up to a certain standard, you get the full amount of the payment. But if you're late or you don't build it as well, we can deduct from you. So private entity is taking those risks, but they're not taking the risk of where the money comes from. The government's saying, as long as you comply, we'll pay you. And that's some of the points here. So there's no revenue risk, there's no toll risk, but there is so-called appropriations risk, which is a legal concept that applies to governmental entities, where even though you may have a contract with a governmental entity, there is a requirement that basically the legislative body, the Illinois General Assembly or the Chicago City Council, will appropriate the funds to pay, because they ultimately have the decision-making authority. You can't contract that away. So there's still a risk that a public entity may choose not to appropriate. But if a public entity chose not to appropriate, that would be like, somebody doing work at your house, and they do the work and they do it right, and you don't pay them. Will that person ever want to come and do work at your house again? Probably not. And with a public entity, it's not just you and that contractor. It's front page news if a public entity ever chose not to appropriate. So it's a technical legal risk, but in practice, a public entity, as long as the work was done and done properly, almost always will appropriate, because if it doesn't, it will impact that ability of the public entity to enter into other contracts or issue debt or take on other obligations with the private sector. There's an SPV, LLC or SPV type entity for these projects, similar to the others. Usually for these, there's a license, not a lease. I'm not gonna have enough time to explain that, but it's basically because there's less risk. With the other ones, because there's greater risk because you're also taking the revenue risk, the financing parties want to have the ability to have a lease of the property. It's also a long-term agreement, but not quite as long as the revenue risk, because you're not financing based on long-term toll revenues. You're financing based on these payments. And similar to the other model, there's a mix of equity, third-party debt, and these federal financing programs also come into play. So I'm going to skip through these, this is like the 401, and I'm going to try to cover in the time remaining 3 different case studies of different projects. So one is, this was really the I guess, first large project I worked on, and it really, it frankly impacted the rest of my career, which was Mayor Brown advised the city of Chicago on the long-term concession of the Chicago Skyway toll bridge. And that transaction closed in 2005. I started working on it in 2002 when I was still a fairly young associate at Mayor Brown. And I assume most of you know or have ridden on the Skyway if you're going to Indiana. It's the large bridge that you take to get to Indiana. And it was built in 1958, and it was owned and operated by the city of Chicago. In the earlier years of the Chicago Skyway, the city issued debt based on tolls. Not enough people rode the Skyway, and the city almost defaulted on that debt. And that had stayed in the mind of people at the city, and including at that time then Mayor Daley, whose father had been the mayor when the Skyway almost defaulted soon after it was built. So the idea here was of a public-private partnership that could shift the risk related to operation of the Skyway, and the possibility that in the future there might not be enough tolls to cover the cost of the Skyway. So the city of Chicago was paid $1.83 billion by private investors for a 99-year concession related to the Skyway. That agreement, so we drafted that agreement, has detailed operating standards and imposes legal requirements on the contractor related to operating and maintaining the Skyway during the course of the term. There's a specific tolling schedule that sets toll limits during the term. But one of the things in these transactions, particularly revenue risk transactions that occurs, is there are limits, but within those limits, the private entity has discretion to increase tolls. And this private entity has consistently increased tolls. So one of the differences in these transactions is when the city was operating the Skyway itself, as long as it met its debt covenants, the city generally did not want to increase tolls because the city council would have to take a vote as to whether to increase tolls. And somebody said, well, you voted to increase tolls on the Skyway, you shouldn't be reelected alderperson, or the mayor's supporting a toll increase on the Skyway. So as part of this contract, when the city council authorized the contract, it also authorized these toll limits over the course of the term, and the private entity acting within those toll limits has increased those tolls. So one of the debates in the space is public entities continuing to operate assets like this, basically acting as rational economic actors, but it's very challenging, meaning increasing tolls because it would be beneficial to raise revenue for the public entity. On the other hand, governmental entities are not always rational economic actors, they're political actors. And that means there's often irrationality, at least in terms of economic terms of governmental entities, but perfectly rational from the perspective of a public entity and why a public entity may choose to do something or not to do something. Under the agreement, there's this responsibility for operations, maintenance, and financial obligations. And then what did the city use the money? Well, they used the money to pay off existing debt. So there was about $500 million of debt on the Skyway at the time. They paid off that debt, paid off other city debt, funded several city programs, and then they continue to maintain $500 million of those proceeds in a reserve. And at roughly a 5% interest rate, that generates $25 million, which is about what the city was receiving each year in excess toll revenues from the Skyway. So that reserve has been pointed to in part by rating agencies when the city's bond rating has increased over time. the fact that the city has maintained that reserve, and it's a form of fiscal stability for the city. This says a little bit about ownership. I know I'm running out of time here. So this is the international aspect. So there are often international parties that are investors in these projects. So when the transaction was entered into in 2005, the investors were Sintra, which is based in Spain, and Macquarie, which is based in Australia. Those two parties sold their interest in 2016 to 3 Canadian pension funds, and pension funds are big investors in infrastructure. And you see their Canada Pension Plan Investment Board is basically like the Canadian Social Security program. And Ontario municipal employees are pensions for municipal employees in the province of Ontario, and the teachers' pension plans for teachers in Ontario. 2 of those 3 Canadian funds sold their interest to another investor called Atlas Arteria in 2022. And one of the ongoing benefits to the city when these sales occur is each time there's a sale of interest like this, because there is a lease attached to the agreement, is that it triggers the Chicago real estate transfer tax. And if those of you are following the initiative that Mayor Johnson has been trying to push, and there's a court challenge to increase the real estate transfer tax, that's the tax. And when the transfer in 2016 occurred, the city made another $28 million. And when the transfer occurred in 2022, because it was a slightly less percentage interest, it resulted in $25 million for the city. I'm going to try to do this really quick. So this is a project in Texas that we worked on. This was to develop a new toll road. So the idea here is if you're riding down a road, and imagine a huge amount of green space in between, and that's basically it's a little hard to make out here, but basically there was an existing free road that was a huge amount of right-of-way still in between. And what the state of Texas did was offer that up to private investors to build new toll lanes in the middle of the road. So you could either choose to pay tolls and have a faster movement. It's almost as if you were going on the Kennedy, and those express lanes, instead of being free, you had to pay, but you knew you would have the ability to ride without any traffic and be able to get to where you needed to be by a certain time. So that's what this project involved. It was with the Texas Department of Transportation. It's a 52-year concession and lease transaction. And here there are 6 equity members. That this has changed over time. But just again, to give an example of some of the international entities, ACS, which is based in Spain, Shikun Benui, which is based in Israel, Infrared, which basically started in London through a bank based in Hong Kong, Star America, which is an American investor that has been purchased by a French investor, Northleaf Capital Partners, which is based in Canada, and Klal Insurance, also based in Israel. Those that composition of investors has changed since that time, and not all of them are still investors in the project. It's now been constructed. Oftentimes, after a project's been constructed, some of the investors then choose to sell off their interest, which is in part what happened here. I'm not going to have time to kind of walk through all the financing sources, but you can see it's a mix of various equity and debt and a federal TIFIA loan and a public contribution. And again, in terms of the example of why you would do this, the winning bidder put in they increased their bid, not only they gave money to the state for the right to build this road, but also they agreed to build more than the other 2 bidders. They agreed to build a huge interchange in addition to building these toll roads, because they thought that interchange would cause more people to ride their toll lane. So they said, well, we'll build more because we think we'll make more money. And for the state, that was a better deal for them. So that's in part why this team won, and why these projects are often, in terms of creative solutions, there was a competitive process that resulted in this. And I'm going to just real quick, the last one is the East End Crossing. This is a project building a bridge between Kentucky and Indiana in the Louisville, Kentucky area. And this is an availability payment project, but it has tolls. So the tolls are not going to the private entity. The tolls are going to the public entity. The private entity is getting those availability payments that I talked about earlier. And the public entity is using the tolls to make the availability payments, okay? And that's a 35-year agreement. You see it's a little bit less than the other one. The equity members, Walsh Investors. Walsh Investors is related to Walsh Construction Company. Those of us in Chicago, you may see Walsh around. So Walsh is a big player in this space, and they invested as well as constructed the project. Vinci, which is based in France, despite it sounds like Leonardo da Vinci, but it's based in France, and they're a huge player in this space. And they also have an affiliated construction company that was involved in the construction, and Bilfinger Berger, which is based in Germany. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry I took us straight on to the end, but if anyone has any final questions. Yep.
I just wanted to have the facility about the people.
Yeah.
Why so new that
Yeah, so I could talk briefly, but so we've done some work on both of those projects. So California High-Speed Rail is a massive project to build high-speed rail. That's all being publicly it's being done. There are private components, but not a pure P3. It's being kind of publicly financed and constructed. The Florida project is purely private. So it's not even being sponsored by a public entity. Now there's permits that they have to get from public agencies. There's federal financing programs that are being utilized to help with the financing of the project. But it's privately, it's being privately constructed, privately financed, and privately operated, not even operated by a public entity. So, and you know, that the Florida project's already in operation. It's being expanded, but the first part's already in operation. The same group is building another segment on the West Coast between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, or outside of Los Angeles and Las Vegas, but same, purely private. So, so that's another. I didn't really get into it, but almost pure private. Yeah, privatization was on the far right end of the continuum I had before. The Florida high speed and California high speed projects are almost like, you know, privatized infrastructure, but with some, you know, you can't fully escape government involvement, but it's being privately financed and constructed and operated. Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the things I didn't really fully cover is a project where a private entity takes revenue risk. Now, Skyway would be in that bucket too, because they're taking the risk of the tolls over the term. But whether it's building a new toll road and taking all the risk related to the tolls, a project like Skyway, where you take an existing toll road and you take all the risk of operating it for 99 years, or the Brightline project, where you're building a new high-speed rail line and you're relying on the fares people are going to pay to ride it. The rate of return for equity in those projects is higher. It's higher risk, higher reward. So often in those projects, it could be, it depends on the project. You know, 12% is sort of a rule of thumb, but depending on the project, it could be higher or lower. It really depends on the project. In an availability project, you're taking less risk, because the only risk not only, but it's real risk, is the construction and operation risk. And you're taking the risk whether you're going to get paid the full amount of the payments that you would be entitled if you comply with the contract. But you're not taking revenue risk. related to the project, which is a big difference. There, the rate of returns are often higher single digit. So again, it's very project specific, but it could be, 8, 9 kind of % rate of return, but it's less risk. And one of the things within infrastructure is there are different investors in infrastructure because there are different risk tolerances within infrastructure. Some risk is smaller, like in those cases, but then in other projects, it's higher because you're taking on more risk. Airport projects are another example that have higher rates of return because often the risk of an airport project winds up being higher. But I hope that helps explain. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Okay. Well, I'm sorry for going over, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. So thank you.